Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Cars Reading Skills workshop as part of your Jack Westin MCAT podcast. As always, you're joined by your hosts, Molly and Usher. Now, in this podcast, we're going to be reading through a passage called The Cuban Crisis. It's the Jack Westin Daily Passage from February 4th. If you're listening to this on February 4th, you can go to our website, jackwestin.com, and you can see that this is posted as the daily for this day. Give it a try, read through the passage, maybe try the questions, and then, play the podcast and see kind of what should we be pulling out of these paragraphs? How might we want to track the ideas that are brought up, etc. If you're not listening to this on February 4th, no worries. We have the link in the description so that you could give this a try. This passage, I think, is a pretty fun one. It's fun in terms of the way that it's presented. I don't think it's the most dry passage out there. The author uses some pretty colorful language at times, pretty descriptive language. So this should be a fun listen. Usher, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I like I usually dislike passages where there's like these super big paragraphs that are like not broken down much. But I
Yeah.
liked how this passage kind of like you had small chunks. There are parts where it's a little longer, but for the most part you had some things that were divided into smaller chunks. So I liked that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started then. So paragraph one. Was the Cuban Missile Crisis the trial run for thermonuclear war, or the sort of war by other means, which leaves the two combatants more anxious to reach a settlement? Okay, so we're kind of starting off with a question on what this, war was. Was it kind of like a practice run for the nuclear war, or was it a different kind of, war where we kind of push both sides to settle faster, right? Like, did it have some kind of, I don't know, agenda to it? Was it military or political in nature? And will it have military or political effects? Okay, so again, more questions, right? Was it about the military? Was it about politics? What kind of impact is it going to have overall? So far, we obviously don't know much about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're just having some questions asked, and I'm, left wondering, well, what is it? I hope the author will tell me. Now that the crisis has receded somewhat, and the missiles are dismantled, and the bombers on their way home, that is the most serious question of all. How will the crisis be understood? Okay, so here we've got a pretty like powerful, final sentence or question, right? We can see that understood is italicized there, and we introduce that final question by saying this is the most serious one. So now that the danger is kind of fading away, the biggest question is what are people going to think the crisis really meant? Like, what are people going to think about the crisis looking back? So here, when I'm thinking about what ideas I'd want to track, they're all questions. So I'd probably personally want to track that last one. How will the Cuban Missile Crisis be understood? And basically, just what does this all mean? Like, what does the Missile Crisis mean? What is its impact? Those are the things. That's the big thing I'm kind of trying to track here. Molly, what did you think? Did you feel the same way? Have any other thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely, right? It's so weird in this first paragraph that we literally have three sentences and all of them are questions. Okay, like when we see questions in Cars passages, I'm like, all right, the author's asking you a question as the reader, right? They want you to think about this and really ponder it, right? They basically are, just trying to figure out like how should we be thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? I agree. I think that last sentence is the most powerful because they said this is the most serious question, right? We were curious about like the nature of it, political versus military. We were wondering like, why did it start, etc. But the key thing is, how is it going to be understood? Okay, so the author hasn't told us anything about the actual Cuban Missile Crisis, right? They haven't told us if it was military or political, and they haven't told us how it should be understood, but that's the stage that has been set that ultimately we should be, proceeding with that in mind. So super weird first paragraph, but I love the way that you read it, right? How is it going to be understood? The second paragraph, moving forward, super, super short. Let's see what we see. So, paragraph two says, in itself, the crisis was disastrous, a naked confrontation of power directly involving the threatened use of nuclear weapons. Okay, so again, we're coming from P1 and we're saying that how is it going to be understood? The author has given us a kernel of that now. Okay, the crisis is a disaster. It's disastrous. Okay, and the language here, it's a naked confrontation of power, right? And the threatened use of nuclear weapons. It's a disaster. It's a big problem. Okay, and the nuclear weapons involved seem to be a pretty huge reason for that. So we kind of get some tone, as well as a direct argument that the crisis is a disaster. We haven't officially said that's how the author wants us to understand it, but it's pretty straightforward in that sentence. We only have one other sentence in this paragraph. It says neither the retrospective nonchalance of Mr. Khrushchev nor the coolness of the Kennedy, in quotes here, high command is enough to convince one that the crisis was wholly under control. Okay, so we're kind of continuing this implication or this statement that this was a disaster and it could have been very dangerous, right? It wasn't under control. So I think between the two, I think the beginning statement of this paragraph was perhaps more important, right? The fact that the crisis was a disaster. But I'm also understanding here that it wasn't under control. Okay, so for myself, I'm thinking, okay, P2, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis, the CMC, right, was a disaster and, out of control or uncontrolled. And that's really all that I'm getting from this. Usher, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so as well, right? Like this paragraph, the big thing is that this crisis was disastrous. One thing I really liked that you did was we came off of paragraph one. Paragraph one was three questions, and it was, the big question was how is it going to be understood? And you like instantly connected paragraph two. You were like, oh, well, I'm looking for the answer to that question. You kept that in your head, and then that part said, the crisis was disastrous. They came right after each other, but that's really important in my belief to do. Like we don't often get paragraphs where there's just questions and that's the whole thing. And you should be thinking about what might the answer be, and Molly was able to connect those two paragraphs together. But I totally agree with you, and I really like how you went through that. So moving on to paragraph three, one of the most significant things about Cuba may turn out to be its timing. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, right? We're talking about what's important with this crisis, and that's when it happened, right? The timing. When did it happen? For Cuba, occurred at a time when basic, profound revisions of strategy were being undertaken by both the Americans and the Soviet Union. Okay, great. I'm glad I'm not seeing a bunch of questions now. It's not only telling me timing was super important, but it's also telling me why timing was super important. And that's because it happened when the US and the Soviet Union were kind of like rethinking their strategies, right, in major ways. In the summer, the US formally adopted the counterforce strategy. Okay. I don't really know what counterforce might be, but probably countering something if I had to guess. After a protracted debate, we appear to be moving rapidly towards the creation of a third nuclear force in Europe. Okay, so they have this like new strategy, right? And what it is they're adding another, nuclear power in Europe, right? Creation of a third nuclear power. So maybe the counterforce is like a prevention defense strategy, so they can counter anything if it comes. I don't know, just thinking here. The Soviet Union must soon decide what its response to this rapidly changing strategy is to be. Okay, so we talked about what the US is doing, right? And now we're talking about how the Soviet Union has to consider what they're going to do. Meanwhile, Berlin, East Germany, and the India China dispute hang fire. So while all this is happening at the same time, we also have Berlin and other major disputes that are kind of tense and unresolved. So the when they said the big thing about Cuba might turn out to be its timing, and now I'm seeing all this other stuff is going on. It's really painting like a big picture for me. There's all this stuff going on all around the world. These decisions will shape the whole conduct of the Cold War for the next 5 years, and the Cuban Missile Crisis will influence them. Okay, so the Cuban Missile Crisis, what's happening in Cuba, is going to shape how the Cold War, is working for the next 5 years, and it's going to influence all of these, countries and the decisions that are involved. Either something yields, or we are heading for a showdown by the mid 1960s. So either someone backs down, some country backs down, or we're going to have a huge war, a huge confrontation, by the mid 1960s. So, what am I trying to track here? Well, I think it was nice because, we kind of have something italicized again in this paragraph, kind of just like the first one. And we're seeing that timing is kind of emphasized there, right? And we talked about the entire paragraph, why that timing is super important. All this stuff is going on all around the world. We have the US trying to make this new nuclear force. We have the Soviet Union trying to decide. We have all these other disputes with these other countries going on. And that's what made the timing so important for the CMC. So I'd probably write down something like timing, imp, important for CMC. What do you think, Molly?
That was beautiful. I feel like so often you hear, or that we hear from students, like when I have like a detail-oriented paragraph, I don't know what to do with it. And I feel like this paragraph might feel that way for a lot of our listeners, right? Like we're talking about a lot of context, historical and political context in different countries, and it's very difficult to keep track of all of them. And I think a lot of our students are like, well, should I memorize all of this? Like, should I be taking notes? Should I be highlighting? What do I do? And I feel like that was a perfect demonstration of like, you find, if you can, the argument, which, yeah, we're saying one of the most significant things, maybe it's timing. And then again, in that next sentence, we described why it was the strategy change. From there, it's context for that argument. Okay, so when you are in the future, a situation like this, you try and find, well, what is the author trying to convince me of? And then how, right? All this detail about the political context in Europe and with the US, this is just helping us understand what they mean by timing and the strategy change. So, yes, completely agree. And I love that when you're saying what you would map, you don't have all of this detail because it's less about all the details and it's more about why the author put those details in there, right? And that's to support this idea about timing and strategic, changes. So, great job. That was a very, very good model for a similar paragraph like this. Okay, so let's look at paragraph 4. Let's see what we're going to get into. So again, we're thinking about timing, we're thinking about changes in context. Now, P4 says, as seen from Washington, the Castro regime that rules Cuba was, quote, unacceptable long before the Soviet missiles arrived. Okay, so we're saying that this was never going to be okay, essentially. We already had a problem with this before, or with Cuba and the Castro regime before the missiles arrived. Okay, so this is a previous issue or a longer standing issue than you might think. So it's good to keep in mind. Latin America, after all, is traditionally regarded by the US as its, quote, back garden. Okay, sounds kind of odd, but it's explaining why it would be unacceptable, right? We're saying because it's so close, we don't want this Castro regime. And I'm saying we as the United States. Okay, so it's giving a context still for this conflict. The US has intervened more than once in the last decade to preserve its special interests in the hemisphere. Okay, so again, we haven't gotten a very, very direct statement of argument, but what I'm understanding so far is why the US got involved, right? They got involved because of basically proximity, right? Because they're so close to the United States. Maybe they want control. The Cuban Revolution was a break in the chain, a challenge to American prestige in the continent, a potential threat to, quote, stability. So yeah, that's again kind of what we're thinking, right? So the U.S. saw Cuba was a threat, essentially, to control or the status quo, so to speak. The Cuban crisis was not, in essence, then a military but a political confrontation. Okay, so I feel like from the earlier sentences, I've been building an understanding of what's going on, but I haven't really had a very direct argument. Maybe Cuba being a potential threat to stability in the sentence previous, but this one is very, very straightforward, right? And I also think, in essence, then is like saying, like, based on that, this must be true. It's an if-then statement almost. Um, I feel like this one stands out to me a little bit more just in how direct and clear it is, and the fact that it really summarizes what we've got going on before, right? We did bring up military versus political motives, actually, way back in P1 and all those questions. Wasn't really a major idea then, but it seems like they're saying the political idea has to do with stability in the region, right? Maybe military is just more pure war. I don't know, but they are saying what we had mentioned previously in P4. This means political confrontation. So I'm going to keep that in mind, and I'm going to probably mentally map this sentence because it's a lot more straightforward than the others. Okay, last sentence here. Indeed, ever since the break between Castro and the US, and months before Castro discovered that he was a Marxist, or Soviet technicians arrived in Havana, the US pursued two objectives in relation to Cuba. One, to bring down the Castro regime, and second, to stop other Latin American states from following Cuba's political lead. Okay, so again, I think this really ties back to this idea that the US involvement in Cuba was political, okay, not military related. Okay, this sentence is really showing the political motives. It maybe it's not like, oh, I just want more territory. Again, I'm kind of imagining that's what we mean by military, but political certainly means I want to keep political stability in my area, right? Again, if I'm the US. So I think as far as this paragraph, we had a lot of context. It's all pretty in line. What I would be tracking is that America, or maybe like AM, America, American motivations. And I might put like political is greater than military, right? That's why the US got involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's what I would
Okay.
say. Sure. What
Yeah.
do you think? How did you
Yeah.
map this one?
No, I totally agree. I wrote down something very similar. I just basically like if I had to write down like yeah, I think how you talked about it in terms of the interest was really important. I'd probably write down something like CMC is POW greater than symbol military or something. Just
Hmm.
because yeah, I mean they did constantly like every time they mentioned this political aspect, like they would say it's more political than military. And then we also talked about that in the first paragraph, like is it military or is it political in nature? So it's kind of nice. Like we had the question about how will it be understood, and then we talked about how it's disastrous. Then we had the question that's like, is it military or political? And now we're like answering that question. I
Hmm.
really like how you broke that down. I felt like it was nice. Another nice thing about this passage was that we've seen like multiple straightforward arguments or ideas, and then they kind of give us context on that. I really like how you broke down that last sentence and made it, very, very much easier to understand in terms of the context. But yeah, we can go ahead and move on to the fifth paragraph. So we see the U.S. has pursued this line with considerable consistency. Okay, so they're kind of following, this line. So I'm assuming, it's kind of their objectives we saw in the sentence right before this, right? This whole political idea, and they're consistent with it, right? They're steady with it. This plan of political confrontation survived a change in administration. The first invasion was planned under Eisenhower and executed under Kennedy. So again, we're saying the word political again, right? And I can't imagine that that's for no reason, right? We're emphasizing the idea that this is a political aspect, and we talked about how it happened over some time. First, it was under Eisenhower, and then it actually happened or was executed under Kennedy. The construction of Soviet missile sites was predated by a new Cuban scare, which began to develop again at the beginning of summer. So even before the missile sites kind of happened, there was this, like, I guess, fear. I'm not really sure this, why they're kind of quoting scare there. I'm assuming it's meant to show some kind of fear, like there's a new wave of fear about Cuba that's kind of growing. I'm not 100% sure, so I'll have to keep reading. As early as the September before the crisis, Edward Rice in Time magazine suggested that the U.S. could support military action against Cuba by anti communist nations in Latin America, or, and it may come to this, it could get the job done itself once and for all. So there's a lot to unpack here, right? So we've got this guy named, Rice. And well, what is he basically saying? He's saying that the US could come and get the job done itself once and for all, or it could support military action against Cuba. So some people have kind of already been talking about supporting or even launching military action against Cuba. If I read into this military aspect too much, maybe I could even start thinking, well, they've been telling us it's political, but now they're talking about a military action. Is it military? Who knows, right? But we know that their intention so far is political. All this was for the benefit of either the US or the Soviet Union or the USSR as they used Cuba to negotiate international politics. Okay, so now again, we end by coming back to this idea of politics, right? So both superpowers, both the US and the USSR, they're using Cuba as a bargaining tool, right, in global politics. So what am I really getting out of this, right? I see that there's this like fear growing about Cuba. I see, in the first sentence that they're emphasizing again the idea that they're pursuing this political aspect. They mentioned politics a couple times here, and they ended with that too. So I would say honestly, this whole paragraph is kind of meant to continue what we saw in paragraph 4. This idea that the CMC was more political than military. In the end, they're ultimately using Cuba to negotiate politics. The only thing how I would kind of map this is probably just write down P5, P4, right? Or if I wanted to write all of it down again, I would just write CMC political. And then I probably also mentioned Rice. Rice was mentioned. He was brought in here as, another supporting idea. And we know that, they can tend to ask us about names sometimes on the MCAT. So I think that that's another thing that would be important to write down. What did you think, Molly?
No, that's perfect. Yeah, and I love that you pointed out they use the word military as one of the options, but then they came right back to political, right? But that's an excellent instinct of like, wait, hold on. We've asked that question, political versus military, a couple times. We've been pretty direct in saying this was political. You see the word military and you're like, should I be worried? And the answer is no, not as we continued and realized we came right back to politics. So that was great because, if you're presented with some decision, right? One or the other, is it political or military? And you make a decision, or the author does, and then they use the other word, you're like, wait, hold on. Did I misunderstand your decision? Right? Ultimately, like you said, no, we came right back to politics. And the author has used that word political so many times, right? Repetition is incredibly powerful. And if you're really stuck at the end of a paragraph and you're not sure what you want to map, right? What you want to write down to help you remember that paragraph. Ask yourself, is there anything that came up a couple times? Even any terms, right? If you have no idea what to write at all, at least you could get maybe the subject of the paragraph. Maybe the idea about that subject's a little bit less clear, but I think thinking of repetition helps. And definitely this one is essentially continuing what we had mentioned in the last paragraph, right? The idea
Right.
is this is a political confrontation, and it's helping, or it's the stage in which the US and the Soviet Union are kind of figuring out how to, you know, create this or how to resolve this conflict, I guess I should say. So really interesting. And believe it or not, actually, we're on our last paragraph. I feel like this passage flew
Wow.
by. I
Yeah.
know. So let's go ahead and look at paragraph 6, and then we can reflect and think, what should the main idea of this passage be? So, paragraph 6, precisely the same estimates were made to me when I was in Cuba at the beginning of the year. I don't know about you. I'm like, wait, what? Who are you, author Stuart Hall? Like, okay, Stuart Hall, our author, is in Cuba and is being told this as well. Okay, whenever the author is writing themselves in the story like this, I'm intrigued. Okay, this individual is not officially saying, I believe this or I buy into it, right? But they are saying that they're connecting themselves to the argument, right? They're saying that they were told this, or they heard it while visiting Cuba. So this is interesting. I would love if the author gave me a really clear statement of, I agree with this, or I didn't agree with this, or I find this limited, or something like that. But I don't have that. So, at least not yet. So let's keep reading. When Oh, super long sentence. When we consider why the Cubans should have requested military assistance from the Soviet Union on such a massive scale, we are apt to forget the disastrous invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs and the stated American intention to achieve the same end by more effective means that avoided direct military conflict. Okay, so we're thinking about we're thinking more deeply about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're talking about the Bay of Pigs as well, and how this is part of this conflict, right? Why would they have asked for nuclear power from the Soviet Union, right? It's just kind of explaining the context a little bit. Um, I'm curious if we're going to take this back to a political slash military reasoning, because it seems like we're just getting more specific from a broad idea of political motivations. So here we're talking about the Bay of Pigs as being a potential, reason for this or motivation for it. But let's see, we have one last sentence. It says Soviet missiles added a nuclear dimension to an already simmering political crisis. Okay, I feel like that last sentence is starting to get more specific, and it feels like this final sentence of our passage kind of broadens it right back up, right? The missiles amplified the political crisis that was already simmering. So in my head, I mean, I think we could get away with still tying this back to paragraph 4, right? We're saying that missiles escalated it, but that's really what the author has been saying this whole passage. So I think for myself, Usher, I might just draw an arrow still from paragraph 4. I don't know if I would add
Yeah.
anything else. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, it's kind of like an interesting sentence. It's saying like in a way that the political crisis became like nuclear, maybe like and not even necessarily like nuclear as in like weapons, but like nuclear, the magnitude of it is so
Mhm.
big. I mean, maybe they're also saying, oh, it's a nuclear dimension as in they're getting into nuclear warfare, but I feel like you could also interpret it as like it became enormous. So, yeah,
Mhm.
I feel like this is also just emphasizing paragraph 4 at the end of the day. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's so interesting because the word nuclear could have multiple meanings, but all
yeah.
of them still support that same message that the author is sharing. Again, like this is hugely important. This is potentially disastrous, right? Like it's all of
Hmm.
these different political motivations really coming to a head with this event. Um, and again, it kind of ties back to our question, how should this be understood? The authors really made it clear how they want us to understand it. And it's that, all of these different political factors really led to, the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it all played out. So, what are you thinking for main idea here?
I'm thinking, when we're looking at our main idea, we have to look at what was repeated the most in the passage. And
Yeah.
we did, address, I would say, most of the questions the author said in the first paragraph, but what we spent the most time on was definitely that idea in paragraph 4. It takes up, more than half of the passage, I would say, like even like 70% of it if I'm looking at it. And it was repeated in paragraph 5, paragraph 6, right? That this conflict is a political conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a is motivated by a political, confrontation, not a military one. So I think that's what I'd be tracking for my main idea. Just paragraph 4 is a big idea there. What about you?
Yes. Yeah, no, same thing. And I think it's interesting. We talked a lot about what it means to have a political motivation, right? Like that, I think is really clear. I don't know about you. I'm kind of curious. We never really explained what a military motivation would be like. We've been very focused on this is all political. This is political. I'm feeling like, I hope it doesn't come up in the questions, but if it does, if we get something, like which of the following would show a military motivation rather than political or something of that nature, I would have to lean into what I know about political and
Yeah.
recognize that the author is presenting these as, for all intents and purposes, mutually exclusive. So, like, because we didn't really characterize what a military motivation would look like, I would just have to use political motivation and eliminate anything that felt like a political motivation. That's the best that I think I really could do because we didn't really clarify, like, oh, by military motivation, I mean that US could gain a new state, or like they didn't give us
Yeah.
anything clear, which is interesting because that really was one of the main questions of the passage, military
Yeah.
or political.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's, a really great way of thinking about, something that they could ask us. I could easily see that being like some sort of analogy question. And then it really throws you off because you've been thinking about political, political, political the whole time. But yeah, like you said, you all have seen what political motivation looks like in this passage. So I think a great way to go about it is just instead of looking for the military option, like look for the political options, eliminate those, and then you should be, left with one that doesn't really fit what we saw in the passage. So
Yes. And on that note, right, there are 6 questions with this passage. This is the perfect time to grab that link in the description or go to the website, right? Navigate to this passage and go try them, right? We always advocate for this at the end of our podcasts here, but when we go through these passages sentence by sentence, we really talk in depth about how we should understand this information, how we should track ideas, what is our main idea. This is the perfect time to go and get some real practice, right? Because again, if you miss some of these questions, it's probably not, hopefully, because you didn't understand the passage, right? It's probably because there was something really tricky about that question, right? It might have been the language of the question or the answer choices that really threw you for a loop. And you then have the benefit of knowing it's because the question. It's not because I misunderstood the passage. So these questions are going to teach you a lot. Definitely go check them out. There are 6. And as always, we hope that you found this useful and we hope that you're excited for the next one the same way that we are. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening or weekend whenever we're catching you. And until we see you next, happy studying.